The Bowie knife carved through the September air with a whisper of steel, its polished blade catching the harsh Wyoming Territory sun before biting deep into the weathered pine of Wolf's Crossing's bulletin board. The marriage contract fluttered against the wood like a dying bird pinned through its center by 12 inches of cold metal that still trembled from the violence of impact. Violet Kettering's breath seized in her throat as she stared at the document that would seal her fate in black ink and territorial law. The words blurred through tears she refused to shed, but their meaning burned itself into her memory. By order of Judge Fritz Mallory, guardianship of Miss Violet Kettering, age 19, orphaned and without means, to be wed to Obadiah Vance for her protection and welfare under territorial statute. Her mother's voice echoed from 3 years past, as clear as if Eva Kettering stood beside her daughter in the dusty street. Promise me, little sparrow. Promise you'll never let them make you small. You carry your father's stubborn heart, and my wild spirit use them both when the wolves come prowling. Those words had been whispered on a winter night, when fever painted her mother's cheeks crimson, and her father was already 6 months cold in the ground. Violet had been 16 then, still believing that promises to dying parents could somehow armor you against the world's cruelties. She'd learned the bitter truth since then. There now, my dear girl, wheezed Obadiah Vance, his voice carrying the false warmth of honey poured over poison. His thick fingers, yellow with tobacco stains and spotted with age, closed around her wrist with surprising strength as he tested the weight of the gold band on her finger. Fits you like destiny itself. Gold never lies about such things. Violet's skin crawled beneath his touch, but she forced herself to remain motionless. At 19, she'd learned the hard lessons that came with being female and alone in unforgiving country. Open rebellion would only bring swifter punishment, but submission felt like drowning by inches. The ring was too heavy, too loose, sliding around her finger like a golden shackle that mocked every dream she'd harbored about choice and dignity and love freely given. Obadiah Vance was a man who wore his 62 years like battle scars, each line in his face a testament to surviving in a land that devoured the weak. His black frock coat, worn despite the afternoon heat, made him resemble an undertaker measuring a corpse, and his pale eyes held the flat emptiness of a rattlesnake watching prey. He'd accumulated power through patience, cunning, and the kind of calculated cruelty that allowed him to wait years for the perfect moment to destroy his enemies. The crowd that had gathered in Wolf's Crossing's main street shuffled restlessly, drawn by the morbid fascination that made people slow their wagons to gawk at hangings. Violet felt their stares like physical weight, some pitying, some judgmental, most simply relieved that someone else's daughter was being sacrificed to satisfy the territory's harsh laws and one man's bottomless greed. Mighty young bride for such an old bridegroom, called out Amos Wickham from the crowd's rear. The lanky farmer's voice carried clearly in the afternoon stillness, followed by nervous chuckles that died quickly under disapproving glares. One-eyed Sam whipped his scarred face toward the sound, his remaining eye glittering with practiced malice. The patch covering his left socket was cracked, leather-stained from years of frontier violence, and the scars cross-hatching his cheeks told stories of knife fights and gun battles he'd survived while opponents hadn't. "Mind your own business, dirt farmer," he growled, hand drifting to the Colt Navy at his hip. "Unless you want to discuss it private-like." The crowd pressed closer, despite the threat courage blooming from collective presence. Children peered between their mothers' skirts, while shopkeepers abandoned counters to witness the spectacle. Even the horses tied at hitching posts seemed to sense the tension, stamping hooves and snorting uneasily. That's when the stranger stepped forward. He emerged from the crowd's edge like smoke given form, moving with the fluid grace of someone who'd learned to walk silently on ground that might betray him to enemies. Perhaps 30 years old, he possessed the lean build of a natural horseman, and the bronze skin that marked him as Lakota. His black hair was woven into 2 braids, adorned with eagle feathers identifying him as a war leader, and his dark eyes held the steady intelligence that made wise men cautious and fools dangerous. Kangji Sapa Black Raven in his native tongue wore buckskin leggings and a blue calico shirt beneath a buffalo robe that spoke of successful hunts and harsh winters survived. The Spencer carbine across his back showed honest wear from constant use, and his belt carried a Bowie knife whose bone handle was polished smooth from years of handling. Most telling were his hands scarred from countless battles, steady as carved stone, currently empty of weapons despite the crackling tension. The crowd parted like water around a boulder, conversations dying as people recognized something in his bearing that commanded both respect and wariness. He stopped exactly 3 paces from where Violet stood beside the bulletin board, close enough to see the fear she fought to hide, close enough to count the premature silver threads in Obadiah's beard. Without breaking eye contact with the older man, Kangji Sapa reached out and placed his scarred hand beneath Violet's chin, lifting her face with infinite gentleness. It wasn't ownership or desire, but recognition. An acknowledgement that said clearer than words, "I see you. I see this injustice. You are not alone in this moment." The effect was electric. Violet's breathing, which had been quick and shallow with barely controlled panic, steadied slightly as she met his dark gaze. For the first time since her nightmare began, she felt like a person rather than property seen and valued for something beyond her potential worth to men who measured everything in dollars and political influence. Obadiah's face flushed red above his white collar color, spreading down his neck like spilled wine. "What the hell do you think you're doing, boy?" He snarled, voice climbing in pitch as control slipped. "Get your filthy hands off my intended bride before I have you horsewhipped for your presumption." "This is wrong," Kangji Sapa said simply, his voice carrying despite its quietness. He spoke English with the careful precision of someone who'd learned it as a second language, each word chosen for maximum impact. "Wrong." Obadiah's flush deepened to purple spittle flying from his lips. "What's wrong is a savage putting his hands on a Christian woman in a civilized town. What's wrong is your kind thinking you have any say in the business of—" "The girl doesn't want it." Kangji Sapa interrupted, his hand still steady beneath Violet's chin. "Any fool can see that much." The simple truth hit the crowd like a physical blow. Everyone present could see evidence of Violet's unwillingness in her rigid posture, too quick breathing, the way her hands trembled despite her efforts at control. But acknowledging that truth meant acknowledging their complicity in something ugly, and most people preferred their complicity unspoken. For a heartbeat that stretched like eternity, Violet felt something she hadn't experienced since her parents' death. The sense that someone was willing to stand between her and forces that threatened to destroy her. Not from expectation of reward or gratitude, but from simple recognition that what was happening was wrong and needed opposing. Her breathing slowed to match his steady rhythm, and for the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to hope. "What I can see," Obadiah snarled, gesturing sharply to his hired men, "is trespassing and interference with legal proceedings. Sam Riley, get this red-skinned." His words vanished in sudden thunder as a freight wagon loaded with mining equipment careened around the corner from the Silver Dollar Saloon. The driver, clearly deep in his cups, sawed at the reins with unsteady hands, trying to control mules spooked into wild panic by something unseen. "Runaway team," someone screamed. People scattered like startled chickens, diving behind water troughs and scrambling onto porches as the heavy wagon skidded sideways through their midst. Iron-rimmed wheels threw up clouds of dust and gravel, while the cargo of pick shovels and ore buckets clanged together like church bells in a windstorm. But Violet, frozen by the crisis's suddenness, didn't move fast enough. The wagon's rear wheel caught her blue dress, rough wood snagging fabric, and threatening to drag her under the grinding mechanism of axle and spoke. She stumbled, crying out, as she felt herself being pulled toward machinery that would crush bones like kindling. Kangi Sapa moved without conscious thought, warrior reflexes responding faster than mind could process threat. His arms snaked around her waist and hauled her against his chest as he dove backward, both hitting dust hard and rolling clear as the wagon thundered past, with cargo still clanging its off-key symphony. For a heartbeat, they lay tangled in the street, her face pressed against his shoulder, his arm protective across her back. She could smell clean scents of sage and wood smoke clinging to his clothes, feel the steady beating of his heart beneath her cheek, sense coiled strength in muscles that held her with careful gentleness. It was the first time in 3 years she'd felt truly safe, protected by something more reliable than legal documents or social conventions. When dust settled and the runaway wagon crashed against the mercantile's porch, Kangi Sapa helped Violet to her feet with steady hands. Her dress was torn and dusty, but she was whole. Their eyes met as he released her, and something passed between them that had nothing to do with gratitude and everything to do with recognition. Two people who understood what it meant to stand alone against overwhelming forces. "Much obliged, stranger." She whispered words barely audible above continuing chaos. Her voice carried strength that hadn't been there before, as if shared danger had reminded her she was more than just a victim awaiting rescue. He nodded, once dark eyes, holding hers another moment, before turning to face Obadiah and his men. His hand moved to rest casually on his knife's bone handle, not quite threat, definitely statement of intent. The message was clear without words. I am here. I will not be moved easily. And if you threaten her again, you threaten me. The crowd slowly reassembled, but the mood had shifted from morbid curiosity to something more volatile. What had begun as a forced marriage ceremony had become confrontation between different kinds of power. Legal authority backed by money and corruption, facing moral authority backed only by willingness to act when action was necessary. Obadiah's face had returned from purple to red, but rage in his pale eyes was joined by something resembling calculation. He understood that public scenes were bad for business, and the gathering crowd was beginning to include people whose opinions could affect his various enterprises throughout the territory. "This isn't finished," he said quietly, voice carrying clearly despite low volume. Not by a long shot. He gestured to Sam and his other men, who'd kept hands near weapons throughout the confrontation. "We'll complete this business properly, with all legal niceties observed." But approaching hoofbeats announced someone whose presence would complicate his carefully laid plans. Deputy Sheriff Paul Larkin rode into the square at a gallop, his horse lathered from hard travel, and his face grim with the determination that came from finally deciding to do right, regardless of consequences. Paul was 30 years old and wore his badge with uncomfortable awareness that it often meant less than the political connections of people he was supposed to police. He'd grown up in Wolf's Crossing, had seen how law could be bent by money and influence, and had spent too many sleepless nights wondering when he'd lost the idealism that first made him want to wear a star. Today felt like his last chance to find it again. "What's all this commotion?" he called out, dismounting with fluid motion of someone who'd spent more time in saddle than on foot. His eyes took in the scene with practiced efficiency. Torn contract still pinned to bulletin board, Violet's disheveled appearance, tension crackling between Kangi Sapa and Obadiah's men crowd of onlookers, showing equal measures excitement and apprehension. "Just a wedding ceremony, Deputy," Obadiah replied, smoothly, voice once again under control. Some folks got excited about the festivities, but nothing concerning law enforcement. Paul's gaze shifted to Violet, and he saw something in her green eyes that made his jaw tighten with suppressed anger. He'd known her since childhood visits to town with her parents, had watched her grow into a young woman of intelligence, and Spirit had seen how her family's death left her vulnerable to exactly the predation that men like Obadiah specialized in. "Miss Kettering," he said, formally tipping his hat. "Are you here of your own free will?" The question hung like gun smoke. Everyone understood her answer would determine whether this remained private matter or became something law would address officially. Violet felt the weight of watching eyes, pressure of expectations and fears, and hopes that had nothing to do with her own desires. When she spoke, her voice was clear despite circumstances. "No, Deputy Larkin, I am not." The simple statement hit like physical blow, confirming what everyone suspected but few had been willing to acknowledge. Paul nodded slowly, hand moving to rest on his Colt's butt as he turned to face Obadiah with expression hardened to granite. "Then I'm afraid this ceremony is concluded," he said quietly. "Miss Kettering, would you like me to escort you somewhere safe while we sort out legal details?" Before anyone could respond, galloping horses announced reinforcements that would turn confrontation into something far more dangerous. Sheriff Dusty Bill rode into the square with a posse of deputized men, faces grim and weapons ready. Bill was a man whose corruption exceeded only by his incompetence, but he understood which side his bread was buttered on, and Obadiah Vance had been spreading that butter generously for years. "Stand down, Larkin," Bill ordered as he dismounted, his own hand moving to his sidearm. "This is a legal proceeding authorized by territorial law. Anyone who interferes will be arrested for obstruction of justice." Battle lines were drawn with Paul and Kangji Sapa facing Bill and his posse, while Violet stood between them like the prize in a deadly game whose rules she'd never been allowed to learn. The crowd began edging back, sensing violence was only heartbeats away, and not wanting to be caught in crossfire. That's when Kangji Sapa made a decision that would change all their lives. Instead of reaching for weapons or preparing for a fight, he couldn't win. He turned to Violet and spoke just loud enough for her to hear above growing tension. "Do you trust me?" he asked simply. She looked into his dark eyes and saw something she'd been searching for since her parents' death. Not just protection, but partnership. Not just rescue, but the chance to save herself with someone strong enough to stand beside her when fighting started. "Yes," she said without hesitation. "Then stay close and move when I move." What followed unfolded with terrible beauty of violence finally unleashed after too much restraint. Kangji Sapa's Spencer came off his shoulder in one fluid motion, brass receiver gleaming as he levered a cartridge into the chamber. But instead of aiming at threatening men, he fired once into ground at horses' feet, the sharp crack sending animals into panic dance of rearing and plunging that scattered riders and onlookers alike. In chaos of dust and shouting men and screaming horses, Kangji Sapa reached Violet in 3 long strides, caught her around the waist, and lifted her onto the back of the nearest mount, a sturdy bay, belonging to one of Bill's deputies. Her arms locked around his ribs instinctively as he swung up behind her heels, driving the animal toward town's edge and the promise of open country beyond. "Stop them!" Obadiah bellowed, voice cracking with rage. One-eyed Sam managed a shot bullet, whining past Kangji Sapa's ear, close enough to burn skin. But by then the fleeing horse was already at town limits and accelerating into the desperate gallop that could cover miles before pursuit organized itself. As they thundered down the road toward Tallow Creek and wild country beyond, Violet pressed her face against Kangji Sapa's back and felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the exhilarating terror of someone who'd finally chosen to fight rather than submit. Her heart hammered against his spine like a drumbeat of rebellion, and for the first time since her parents' death, she allowed herself to believe her life might contain possibilities beyond mere survival. Behind them, Wolf's Crossing erupted into chaos as various factions began organizing pursuit. But for now, in this moment of flight and freedom and shared danger, Violet Kettering was no longer a victim waiting rescue. She was a woman who'd chosen her own path, consequences be damned. The marriage contract still fluttered from its nail, but the girl it was written to claim was already miles away, and riding hard toward whatever justice might be possible in land where justice was something you made for yourself with courage and allies and determination never to surrender to those who would make you small. They'd been riding hard for 2 hours when Kangi Sapa finally allowed their stolen horse to slow the animal's sides, heaving with exhaustion and coat dark with sweat. The country around them had changed from Wolf's Crossing's settled valley to wild landscape of broken hills and hidden canyons stretching toward mountains. This was land that belonged more to elk and eagles than to men who tried claiming it with surveyor's marks and legal documents. The limestone cave where they took shelter was little more than a crack in canyon wall, but deep enough to hide them and their mount from searching eyes. Cold waters seeped through porous rock, creating steady drip that echoed in darkness like stone heartbeat. And the entrance was screened by wild grapevines that would hide them from casual observation. Kangi Sapa had discovered this place during a hunting expedition 3 winters past, and he'd never forgotten its location or advantages. It was one of perhaps a dozen such refuges scattered throughout his hunting territory, each carefully chosen and prepared for exactly this kind of emergency. Violet dismounted on unsteady legs, her body aching from unfamiliar demands of riding at speed over rough terrain. She'd grown up on Illinois farm and knew her way around horses, but this had been different wild flight through country that could kill the careless or unlucky. Her blue dress was torn and stained with dust and horse sweat, and her carefully braided hair had come loose during escape. "How far behind are they?" she asked, trying to keep fear from her voice. Kangi Sapa was busy unsaddling their horse and checking its legs for injuries, hands moving with practiced efficiency, while eyes remained alert for pursuit signs. "Far enough," he replied. "But not far enough for long. Vance has money and men, and both travel fast when they need to." The bundle he'd brought contained survival essentials, dried buffalo meat that would keep for weeks, parched corn mixed with prairie berries, a small pouch of medicinal herbs treating everything from wounds to fever, and flint and steel wrapped in oiled leather that would make fire even in wet weather. Most importantly, it contained something he'd acquired that morning from Cole Annie's saloon information that might be enough to destroy Obadiah's plans if they could stay alive long enough to use it. "You need to get out of those wet clothes," he said without looking at her hands, busy building small fire from dry wood he'd cached months earlier. "Cold kills faster than bullets out here." Violet's face burned despite their circumstances. I couldn't. It wouldn't be proper." He turned to face her dark eyes, serious but not unkind. "Propriety is luxury for people who aren't running for their lives. Dead women don't worry about their reputation." The blunt truth cut through her protests like knife through silk, but 3 years of careful upbringing couldn't be discarded easily. The very idea of undressing in front of a man, even one who'd risked his life to save her, made her stomach clench with anxiety, having nothing to do with physical danger. Kangi Sapa seemed to understand, without explanation. He pulled his buffalo robe from his shoulders and hung it across cave mouth like curtain blocking their hiding place from outside observation, while allowing air circulation. Then he turned his back and busied himself arranging the fire-broad shoulders, presenting barrier that was somehow more reassuring than any promise. "There's nobody to see but me," he said quietly, "and I give you my word as warrior that I won't look. But you need warmth and dryness, or this rescue won't mean much to either of us." Genuine concern in his voice, combined with practical necessity, finally convinced her. Moving quickly and quietly, Violet slipped out of the sodden dress and wrung water from it with shaking hands. Her cotton undergarments were damp but not soaked, and they would serve for modesty until her dress dried. When she wrapped herself in corner of his buffalo robe, she was surprised by its softness and warmth. The hide had been expertly tanned and worked until it felt almost like velvet, and it carried clean scents of sage smoke and mountain air that seemed to define everything about the man who'd given it to her. "Thank you," she said softly, settling beside the small fire with relief she couldn't hide. "We'll share warmth," he replied, still not turning around. Back to back. Most efficient way to conserve heat without... He gestured vaguely, indicating the impropriety that worried her. They arranged themselves carefully, sitting with backs pressed together and buffalo robe draped over both. The warmth was immediate and blessed, but more than that was security from his solid presence. For the first time since her aunt's death, Violet felt like she wasn't completely alone in a world that seemed determined to destroy her. "Why?" she asked finally, the question that had been building since their escape. "Why did you help me? You don't know me, and getting involved in my troubles has brought nothing but danger." Kangisapa was quiet so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his words carried weight of old pain and fresh determination. "My brother died last winter," he said, eyes fixed on small fire, providing their only warmth against mountain cold. Tsikala means little one in our language. He was 17, full of the courage that makes young men think they're immortal. He paused, using stick to adjust burning wood, and sent sparks spiraling into darkness, where they died like falling stars. Obadiah's men had strung wire across approaches to Tallow Creek, cutting off water access my people had used since before white man came to this country. When Tsikala led party to cut fence, they were waiting. Shot him down like dog for crime of trying to water his horse. Violet felt something cold settle in her stomach, having nothing to do with mountain air. The same water your mother's claim covers," he confirmed. "I came to Wolf's Crossing seeking legal justice, trying to work within white man's law for satisfaction. When I saw what Vance was doing to you, I realized your fight and mine were the same fight. He's willing to kill for what he wants, whether Lakota warriors or white women. Only difference is methods." Outside their cave-distant voices carried on evening wind too far to make out words, but close enough to indicate their pursuers were methodically searching the canyon system. Kangisapa moved to entrance, peering carefully around his buffalo robe barrier. Through gathering dusk, he could see at least 6 riders moving along canyon floor torches, creating dancing circles of light that turned landscape into nightmare. They were searching systematically, checking every possible hiding place, with thoroughness of men who understood their employer's patience had limits. "They're getting close," he said quietly. "We'll have to move soon." But as he spoke, sharp crack of rifle shot echoed off canyon walls, followed immediately by ricochet whine off limestone near their cave mouth. Rock chips stung Violet's cheek, drawing thin line of blood she touched with trembling fingers while her heart hammered like trapped bird. "Found you." The voice belonged to One-Eyed Sam, carrying ugly satisfaction of hunter, who'd finally cornered dangerous prey. "Come out peaceful-like, and maybe the girl doesn't get hurt worse." Kangisapa's response was to lever fresh cartridge into his Spencer and send carefully aimed shot toward the voice. He wasn't trying to kill, not yet, but the heavy bullet came close enough to send the hired gun scrambling for the better cover behind fallen boulder. "Two can play that game," Sam shouted, and cave mouth erupted in shower of rock fragments as return fire peppered limestone. Ricochets were more dangerous than direct shots in confined space, filling air with buzzing fragments of lead and stone. Violet pressed against back wall, one hand covering cut on cheek, while other clutched buffalo robe. Gunfire was deafening in enclosed space, and acrid powder smoke made her eyes stream tears, having nothing to do with fear and everything to do with simple survival. Kanji Sapa fired twice more shots, spaced and deliberate. Each time, return fire was immediate and intense, but increasingly wild. As attackers were forced to shoot from positions offering poor visibility and worse footing. The Spencer's rapid loading mechanism gave him advantage in sustained fire, but ammunition wasn't unlimited. "How many?" Violet asked during brief lull. "Too many," he replied grimly, checking remaining cartridges. 6, maybe 8, and they're not going anywhere. That's when they heard hoofbeats approaching at gallop, followed by voice neither had expected, Deputy Paul Larkin, shouting with authority that came from finally deciding to do right, regardless of consequences. "Federal marshals coming up South Trail." Paul bellowed, voice echoing off canyon walls with convincing urgency. "Anybody wanting to avoid necktie party better clear out before they arrive." It was bluff. Paul was alone, and nearest federal marshals were probably in Denver, 300 miles away. But One-Eyed Sam had enough experience with law to know that shooting it out with federal authorities was a reliable way to end up dancing on air. "This ain't over," Sam called out. But sound of his voice was already receding as he and his men pulled back. "Not by long shot." Paul appeared at cave mouth minutes later, badge glinting in firelight and rifle ready for trouble. He looked harried and dusty from hard riding, but his eyes held steady determination of man who'd finally found his moral center. "You folks all right?" he asked, keeping voice low to avoid attracting attention from any of Sam's men still within earshot. Kangi Sapa lowered rifle, but didn't set it aside. "Deputy, wasn't expecting help from law." "Some laws are worth enforcing," Paul replied, "even when people signing paychecks disagree. You got evidence of wrongdoing." They showed him documents Kanji Sapa had obtained from Cole. Any proof that the saloon owner had been keeping careful track of territorial corruption for her own protection. Paul's expression grew serious as he read through evidence of bribery, fraud, and systematic theft that stretched from Wolf's Crossing to territorial capital. "This is enough to bring charges," he said slowly. "But getting it to right people will be the trick. Obadiah's got friends in high places who won't want to hear about his business practices." "What do you suggest?" Violet asked. She'd managed to slip her dress back on while men examined papers, and though still damp and torn, it restored some measure of dignity. Paul considered weighing options that all carried significant risks. "There's circuit judge coming through next month, Judge Hamilton from Cheyenne. He's honest, probably only honest judge left in territory, and he owes no favors to anybody around here. If we can keep you alive until then and get this evidence before him, we might have chance at real justice." "And if we can't?" Kangi Sapa asked. Paul's smile was grim but determined. "Then we'll have to make our own justice. But let's try legal way first. It's what separates us from animals." As they prepared to leave cave and continue flight through increasingly dangerous country, Violet found herself looking back at place where she'd first felt truly protected since her family's death. The limestone walls had sheltered her from more than bullets. They'd given her a glimpse of what it might feel like to trust someone completely. She'd entered cave as frightened girl running from forces beyond her control. She was leaving as young woman who understood that survival sometimes required courage, and courage was easier to find when you didn't have to find it alone. The blood on her cheek had dried to thin red line that would barely scar. But lesson written in that blood would mark her forever. Sometimes only way to survive was to fight back. And fighting back was always easier when you had someone strong and trustworthy fighting beside you. The journey north through Timber Fork took them through country that seemed designed to test human endurance limits. They traveled by night when possible, following game trails winding between stands of pine and aspen, scarred black by lightning fires from previous summer. The burned landscape provided cover from distant observation, but also served as constant reminder of how quickly natural world could turn deadly. Kangi Sapa proved more than just protector. During those long nights of careful travel, he was teacher whose frontier survival knowledge could mean difference between life and death. He showed Violet how to read wind for weather signs, identify sounds, meaning danger, and distinguish them from normal chorus of night-hunting animals moved through rough country without leaving tracks skilled pursuers could follow. "Your horse's hooves tell story," he explained as they paused beside creek to water mounts. Depth of print, how edges crumble, how far apart they are, all speaks to someone who knows how to listen. We change gait direction, even which horse carries more weight. Make story harder to read. Violet absorbed these lessons with desperate attention of someone understanding that ignorance could be fatal. She'd grown up on farm and wasn't afraid of hard work or difficult conditions, but this was different existence, where every decision carried life or death consequences with no margin for error. On their second night sheltering in ruins of abandoned line shack, gutted by fire years earlier, she finally asked the question haunting her since escape. "There's something more to this, isn't there?" she said, voice barely audible above wind moaning through broken rafters. "Something you haven't told me about why you helped." Kangi Sapa adjusted small fire, providing their only warmth against mountain-cold sparks rising toward smoke hole where they died like falling stars. When he spoke, his words carried weight of revelation. "When I was at Cole Annie's saloon, I overheard Courier talking about papers from Tombstone Ridge. He'd been drinking, complaining about his boss called him Stingy Vance, and mentioned something about messy papers on Widow Kettering's water rights. Under territorial law and the frontier doctrine of prior appropriation, first in time, first in right, the party who first diverted water for a beneficial use held the senior claim, regardless of later settlers." Violet's breath caught. "My mother..." Annie confirmed it. "Your mother filed water rights claim years ago under her maiden name before she married your father. The claim covers headwaters of Tallow Creek, same water Kikala died trying to reach." The implications struck her like physical blow. "That's why Obadiah wants to marry me. Not for companionship, but for legal control of something he can't take any other way. Water worth fortune in this country," Kangi Sapa confirmed. "But there's more. Those survey notes mention mineral rights, silver deposits. Enough wealth to make dozen men rich if they can control water needed for mining operations." Their conversation was interrupted by sound of distant gunfire, not sharp crack of rifles, but deeper boom of shotgun being discharged repeatedly. The shots came from direction of Timber Fork Small Settlement, where they'd hoped to resupply before continuing flight toward whatever safety high country might offer. "That's not hunting," Kangi Sapa said grimly, rising to kick dirt over fire. "Too regular, too sustained. Someone's fighting for their life down there." They rode toward sound with caution, born from understanding that every choice carried potentially fatal consequences. What they found when they reached ridge overlooking Timber Fork was exactly what they'd feared: settlement under attack by what appeared to be Sheriff Dusty Bill and dozen deputized men conducting search that looked suspiciously like organized intimidation. Through Kangi Sapa's field glasses, they could see armed men kicking in doors and dragging people from homes. Shotgun fire was coming from General Store, where someone was making desperate stand against overwhelming odds. "They're not looking for us," Violet realized. "They're punishing anyone who might help us." The systematic nature of violence made clear this was Obadiah's strategy for dealing with problem they represented. If he couldn't catch them directly, he'd make it impossible for them to find shelter or support by terrorizing anyone who might sympathize with their cause. As they watched destruction unfolding below, they saw something that changed everything. Lone Rider approaching Timber Fork from east, moving at desperate gallop that spoke of urgent news. Even at distance, they could recognize distinctive figure of Marie Dubois, French schoolteacher, who tried protecting Violet from Obadiah's initial advances. Marie's arrival caused immediate change in attack dynamics. Instead of continuing their search, Bill's men gathered around her with attention, suggesting she carried information they needed. Through field glasses, they could see her gesturing urgently in various directions, as if describing possible escape routes or hiding places. "She's not betraying us," Kangisapa said with certainty. "Look at her body language. She's angry, not cooperative. They're threatening her to try getting information." Confirmation came when they saw Marie suddenly break away from captors and run toward church at town center, shouting something they couldn't hear over distance. Bill's men pursued, but not before she'd managed to ring church bell 3 times, signal any frontier community would recognize as call for help. Bell's message was answered almost immediately by rifle fire from surrounding hills where scattered Timber Fork residents had taken refuge when attack began. It wasn't organized defense, but effective enough to force Bill's men to take cover and abandon systematic intimidation in favor of more tactical approach. "We have to help them," Violet said, voice tight with emotion. "Marie helped me when I had nowhere else to turn. I can't leave her to face this alone." Kangisapa understood sentiment, but also understood mathematics. 12 of them, 2 of us. Even with surprise, those aren't odds favoring righteous. "Then we don't fight them directly," she replied, mind working through possibilities with desperate creativity born from having no good options. "We create distraction, give people down there chance to organize real defense." The plan they settled on was audacious to point of seeming suicidal, but had advantage of being simple enough to execute under pressure. Using techniques Kangisapa had learned during warrior years, they would approach settlement from blindside and set fire to hay barn on eastern edge of town. Fire would serve multiple purposes, create chaos and confusion, covering escape of anyone still trapped, force Bill's men to choose between pursuing search and dealing with immediate threat of structure fire that could spread to other buildings and provide enough light and smoke to mask tactical movements by defenders. "Fire is like living thing," Kangisapa explained as they prepared torches from pine branches and rendered fat. "Demands attention and respect from everyone who encounters it. Even men, showing no mercy to women and children, will work together to keep flames from spreading to their own property." Approach to Timber Fork required all of Kangisapa's stealth and fieldcraft knowledge. They left horses hidden in Aspen Grove and covered last half-mile on foot, moving through shadows and using terrain to mask presence from any sentries Bill might have posted around settlement's perimeter. Setting fire was easier than approaching barn. Summer drought had left hay dry as tinder, and their improvised torches caught it immediately. Within minutes, flames were climbing walls and racing across roof with hungry enthusiasm of living thing given unlimited food. Effect on attackers was exactly what they'd hoped. Shouts of alarm replaced methodical commands that had characterized search, and Bill's men began abandoning positions to deal with immediate threat of fire that could spread to valuable property if not contained quickly. But distraction came at cost. As they retreated from barn toward hidden horses, Violet stumbled over root concealed by fallen leaves and went down hard on left ankle. Pain shooting up her leg was immediate and intense, sharp agony, indicating serious injury rather than simple bruising. "I can't put weight on it," she gasped, trying unsuccessfully to stand. "Something's wrong. I think it might be broken." Kangisapa was beside her instantly, hands moving over injured ankle with gentle efficiency of someone who'd treated battlefield wounds before. "Not broken," he said after a moment, "but badly sprained. You won't be doing any running for a while." Sound of approaching voices made clear they'd been discovered despite precautions. Bill's men had realized fire was no accident, and they were conducting systematic search with thoroughness that would inevitably find two people who couldn't move quickly through rough terrain. "Leave me," Violet said, voice steady despite pain. "Take evidence and get it to that honest judge Paul mentioned. Don't let my injury ruin everything we've accomplished." Kanji Sapa's response was to lift her in his arms with gentle strength that made her weight seem negligible. "We started this together," he said firmly. "We'll finish it together." What followed was desperate flight through country, seeming designed to test human endurance limits. Carrying Violet while evading armed pursuit required every survival skill Kangi Sapa had learned during warrior years, but it also required something more: determination that came from protecting someone who'd become precious to him in ways going beyond simple duty or honor. They reached hidden horses just as first searchers appeared at wood's edge, torches creating dancing circles of light that turned forest into nightmare landscape of moving shadows and potential threats. Mounting while Violet's ankle made it impossible for her to help was challenge requiring careful coordination. But they managed just as rifle fire began peppering trees around them. The ride that followed existed in space between heroism and madness. Kanji Sapa guided their horse through terrain that would have been challenging in daylight, while Violet clung to him with arms that trembled from pain and exhaustion, but never loosened their grip. When they finally stopped at Hidden Spring deep in mountains, both understood something fundamental had changed between them. Shared danger and trust required for survival had created bonds going beyond practical necessities of their situation. As Kangi Sapa used willow bark and rawhide strips to bind Violet's injured ankle, she found herself studying his face in moonlight, memorizing lines around his eyes and careful way his hands moved over her injury. When he finished and looked up to meet her gaze, moments stretched between them like held breath. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for everything." His response was to touch her cheek with fingertips, gentle despite calluses earned through years of hard living. "You don't need to thank me for doing what's right." "Maybe not," she replied, covering his hand with hers. "But I want to anyway." They didn't kiss. Customs of both their cultures and practical demands of their situation made such displays inappropriate. But look they shared carried promises having nothing to do with romance and everything to do with partnership that could withstand whatever challenges lay ahead. As they settled to rest beside Spring with Violet's ankle elevated and Kanji Sapa's rifle within easy reach, both understood their relationship had evolved beyond simple dynamic of protector and protected. They were partners now bound together by shared danger and mutual respect and growing certainty that their individual fights for justice had become something larger and more meaningful when combined. 3 days later, they discovered the abandoned camp that would change everything. Hidden in grove of aspens near High Mountain Meadow, they found remains of temporary settlement that had been vacated recently enough for ashes to still be warm. But this hadn't been camp used by bounty hunters or hired guns. Debris scattered around cold fire pit included surveyor's equipment, territorial government documents, and most damning of all, leather portfolio marked with seal of major mining company based in San Francisco. "This isn't just about your water rights anymore," Kangi Sapa said grimly as he examined maps showing mineral claims stretching across half territory. "This is about systematic program to steal land and resources on scale reaching all way to California." The documents they found painted picture of corruption staggering in scope and audacity. Obadiah Vance wasn't just local criminal, he was key piece in network involving territorial officials, federal appointees, mining company executives, and financial interests, stretching from Denver to San Francisco to Washington, D.C. "Look at this," Violet said, holding up letter written on expensive stationery. It's addressed to someone in Interior Department discussing relocation of hostile elements and administrative efficiency of consolidating land ownership. They're not just stealing individual claims, they're trying to steal entire counties. But their discovery of wider conspiracy brought immediate danger. As they examined documents, sound of approaching riders made them freeze. Through trees, they could see at least 8 men moving up mountain trail with systematic precision of military patrol. They came back for these papers. Kangi Sapa whispered quickly, gathering most incriminating documents. Probably realized they left evidence behind. What followed was tense game of hide-and-seek among aspens, with Violet and Kangi Sapa using every scrap of cover, while armed men searched camp for missing documents. Her injured ankle made movement difficult, but she gritted teeth and followed his lead as they worked their way toward where they'd hidden horses. The escape was narrow. They reached their mounts just as searchers began expanding their perimeter. But they'd gathered enough evidence to prove conspiracy reached far beyond local corruption. They were no longer just fighting for one woman's freedom. They were carrying information that could reshape political and economic landscape of entire territory. Journeyed toward Grey Wolf Bluff, where Kangi Sapa's people maintained winter camp, took them through some of most beautiful and dangerous country and territory. They rode through valleys where early snow had dusted peaks, and across ridges where wind cut through clothes like ice knives. Horses struggled with altitude and rough terrain, breathing labored and movements careful on ground that could turn treacherous without warning. But real danger came from systematic pursuit Obadiah had organized, using resources that seemed almost unlimited. They caught glimpses of enemies throughout first-day distant riders on parallel ridges, smoke from campfires in places where no honest travelers would stop, flash of sunlight reflecting off metal that might have been rifle barrels or telescope lenses. "He's got at least 20 men involved," Kangi Sapa observed as they paused on ridge to study back trail. "More than I thought he could afford to pull away from other business." "Maybe his other business is more threatened by our evidence than we realized," Violet suggested. "If corruption goes as deep as those papers suggest, exposure could bring down a lot more than just his local operations." They reached Lakota camp as sun was setting over Grey Wolf Bluff, painting devastation in harsh golden light. What had once been thriving community of winter lodges and carefully tended horse herds was now a collection of makeshift shelters and scattered possessions. Attack by territorial soldiers had been swift and brutal, leaving a band of 60-odd people struggling to rebuild from ashes. Tallulah met them at camp's edge, her left arm bound with splints, marking her as casualty from winter's violence. She was a woman of perhaps 25 years, with beauty coming from strength rather than softness, and her dark eyes held questions demanding honest answers. "Cousin," she said to Kangi Sapa in Lakota, then switched to English for Violet's benefit. "You bring strangers to our fires at a time when strangers mean danger." "I bring allies," he replied firmly, dismounting and helping Violet down with careful attention to her injured ankle. "And evidence that our enemies are same enemies." Conversation that followed was conducted in mixture of Lakota and English, with both languages, ensuring nothing important was lost in translation. Violet found herself subjected to scrutiny she'd experienced before, from people who had good reason to distrust white promises and intentions. But when Kangi Sapa opened dispatch case and began explaining documents they'd discovered, mood in camp began shifting from suspicion to something approaching excitement. Evidence of corruption and land theft resonated with people who'd experienced both firsthand and possibility of legal redress, offered hope where there had been only resignation. It was during examination of Violet's mother's water rights claim that Tallulah made connection, tying everything together. She disappeared into one of lodges and returned with small bundle wrapped in soft doe-skin personal possessions that had belonged to Cikala before his death. "Your brother kept treasures," she explained to Kangji Sapa. "Things he found that seemed important, even if he didn't understand their meaning." Among those possessions was a small tin disc, tarnished with age, but still clearly readable. Stamped into metal in crude but legible letters were words, "EVA Kettering, Tallow Creek Headwaters, surveyed by a Fenwick." Violet's hands trembled as she took disc, recognizing immediately what it meant. "This is original claim marker." "But how did Cikala—" "He found it last winter when he went to cut fence blocking our horses from water," Tallulah explained, voice heavy with emotion. "It was lying in snow beside creek, like someone had dropped it and couldn't find it again." The implication struck with force of revelation. Cikala hadn't died in random clash over fence cutting. He'd been murdered because he discovered proof of Obadiah's illegal activities. Claim marker in his possession would have exposed Rancher's scheme to steal Violet's inheritance, making young Lakota warrior direct threat to fortune in water and mineral rights. But there was more. From same bundle, Tallulah withdrew folded paper stained, but still legible. It was letter written in woman's careful script and addressed to "My dearest daughter." Violet's breath caught as she recognized her mother's handwriting. With shaking hands, she unfolded letter and read aloud, "My dearest Violet, if you are reading this, then I am gone, and you are alone in world that is not kind to women without protection. I have done something that may seem foolish, but I pray you will understand. Water rights I filed under my maiden name are yours by right of birth and law, but I have hidden them where greedy men will not easily find them. If you ever need proof of your inheritance, look for marker at headwaters of Tallow Creek. Surveyor Albert Fenwick can be trusted. He has copies of all proper documents. But beware, my darling girl. There are men who will kill to control that water, and you must be stronger and smarter than they are if you hope to survive. Use knowledge wisely, trust carefully, and remember that sometimes only way to live free is to fight for what is rightfully yours. All my love, Mother." Silence that followed was broken only by crackling of cook fires and distant sound of horses moving through meadow grass. Everyone present understood they'd witnessed something transcending simple story of forced marriage and daring rescue. This was evidence of conspiracy building for years, one that had already cost lives and would cost more before finished. "Your mother knew what she was facing," said Winona, elderly woman, whose aged voice carried wisdom of someone who'd survived 8 decades of frontier life. She prepared as well as she could, but even wise women cannot always protect their children from wolves that hunt in darkness. As they planned their next moves around evening fire, Violet found herself sitting close to Kangji Sapa, their shoulders touching as they studied documents and maps by flickering light. The casual intimacy felt natural now, born from shared danger and growing trust that had nothing to do with social conventions and everything to do with recognition of equals. "What do we do now?" she asked, watching sparks rise toward stars beginning to appear in darkening sky. "We finish what we started," he replied, voice carrying quiet determination of someone who'd finally found cause worth dying for. "We get this evidence to people who can use it, and we make sure Cikala's death and your mother's sacrifice weren't in vain." The plan they developed over next 2 days was audacious in scope and desperate in execution. Using connections Tallulah maintained with other native bands throughout territory, they would spread word of corruption evidence to communities that had suffered under similar schemes. Simultaneously, they would send copies of most damaging documents to newspapers in Denver and San Francisco, ensuring story reached audiences beyond reach of territorial corruption. But most dangerous part involved returning to Wolf's Crossing for direct confrontation with Obadiah Vance and his allies. It was strategy requiring either supreme confidence or complete desperation, and all understood which category best described their situation. During one of their planning sessions, as they sat beside creek, winding through meadow below Grey Wolf Bluff, Violet asked question that had been growing in her heart since their escape from Wolf's Crossing. "If we don't make it through this," she said quietly, "I want you to know these have been best weeks of my life. Not because of danger or excitement, but because I finally found someone who sees me as more than property to be bought and sold." His response was to take her hand in his intertwining fingers, with care that spoke of promises too important for words. "We're going to make it through this," he said firmly. "Both of us. Together." The kiss that followed was their first, and it tasted of hope and determination and love, strong enough to survive whatever trials lay ahead. When they separated, both understood they'd crossed line that couldn't be uncrossed. They were no longer just allies in fight for justice, but partners in relationship that would define rest of their lives. As they made final preparations for journey back to Wolf's Crossing, everyone in camp understood they were witnessing something that might change course of history in their corner of world. Evidence they carried could expose corruption reaching highest levels of territorial government, but only if they could survive long enough to present it to people with authority and integrity to act. The storm that lashed Wolf's Crossing on night of their return arrived like divine judgment, bringing sheets of rain that turned dusty streets into rivers of mud and lightning that illuminated town in stark, apocalyptic flashes. Thunder rolled across valley with sound of distant artillery, and wind drove rain horizontally with force that made standing upright challenge. They'd spent day hidden in abandoned mine shaft 2 miles from town, watching comings and goings through Kanji Sapa's field glasses and finalizing plan that would either bring justice or get them killed. What they'd observed had been encouraging Obadiah's support seemed to be crumbling as word of wider federal investigation reached even Wolf's Crossing's remote location. "Half his hired guns have disappeared," Kanji Sapa noted as they watched activity around Obadiah's ranch through driving rain. "Smart ones are probably halfway to Mexico by now. But he still has One-Eyed Sam and few others," Violet replied, checking loads in rifles she'd learned to use during their weeks together. "Desperate men are most dangerous." Their opportunity came when storm reached peak intensity, bringing winds that flattened buildings and rain that turned entire landscape into shallow lake. In chaos and confusion, they made their way into town through back alleys and side streets, moving toward final confrontation that would determine outcome of everything they'd worked for. But as they approached Main Street, they discovered situation was even more desperate than they'd anticipated. Obadiah, cornered by crumbling conspiracy and facing inevitable federal charges, had made decision that would raise stakes beyond anything they'd imagined. "Help someone help." The voice was Marie Dubois, calling from second floor of hotel where she was being held prisoner along with Dr. Hale. Through rain-lashed windows, they could see One-Eyed Sam and 2 other gunmen keeping watch over hostages, while Obadiah himself paced back and forth like caged animal. "It's trap," Kanji Sapa said grimly. "He's using them as bait to force us into open. Then we give him what he wants." Violet replied, her voice steady despite circumstances. "But on our terms." What followed was careful orchestration of approach that used storm as cover and buildings as concealment. They separated with Kanji Sapa positioning himself where he could cover hotel's front entrance, while Violet worked her way around to rear stairs that led to second floor. The climb up external staircase was treacherous in driving rain, But Violet had learned to move with confidence, born from weeks of survival in harsh conditions. Her injured ankle still pained her, but she'd developed techniques for managing disability that didn't slow her significantly. She reached second-floor landing just as lightning illuminated scene inside hotel room. Marie and Dr. Hale were tied to chairs, while one-eyed Sam kept rifle trained on them. Obadiah was at window peering through rain-streaked glass and talking to himself with rambling intensity of man whose carefully constructed world was collapsing around him. "Should have killed that girl when I had chance," he was saying. "Should have realized she'd be nothing but trouble from start. But no, had to be clever, had to make it look legal." Violet's entrance through rain-lashed door was swift and silent rifle, aimed at one-eyed Sam before he could react. "Drop the weapon," she said quietly, voice carrying clearly despite Storm's fury. "It's over." Sam's response was predictable. He tried to swing his rifle toward her while using Dr. Hale as human shield. But weeks of training with Kangi Sapa had prepared Violet for exactly this situation. Her shot was precise, striking Sam's weapon and sending it spinning across room while bullets' impact numbed his hands enough to prevent any immediate retaliation. Obadiah's reaction was more dangerous. Instead of surrendering, he pulled out stick of dynamite mining explosive he'd been carrying as last resort. "You want to see how this ends?" he screamed, thumb poised over fuse. "Then we'll all go together." The standoff that followed stretched like eternity, with Violet covering Obadiah while trying to calculate whether she could reach him before he could light fuse. Rain hammered against windows, while lightning created stroboscopic effects that made everything seem unreal and nightmarish. That's when Kangi Sapa appeared in doorway, water streaming from his hair and clothes, but rifle steady in his hands. "It's finished, Vance," he said calmly. "Federal marshals are at bottom of stairs. Judge Hamilton arrived this afternoon with warrants for everyone involved in your conspiracy." "Lies." Obadiah snarled, but his voice lacked conviction. Through windows, they could all see torches and lanterns gathering in street below. Despite Storm, too many lights for small-town curiosity, too organized for random crowd. Dr. Hale's been talking to federal investigators for 2 days. Kangi Sapa continued, voice carrying quiet authority of man who'd finally seen justice within reach. "So has Paul Larkin. So have dozen other people who suffered under your schemes. Game's over." The resolution, when it came, was both anticlimactic and satisfying. Instead of lighting dynamite and taking everyone with him, Obadiah simply collapsed into chair shoulders, sagging with defeat of man, who'd finally run out of options. The stick of explosive rolled harmlessly across floor as he buried face in hands. 20 years, he said quietly. 20 years building empire, and it all comes down to one girl who wouldn't do what she was told. "It comes down to justice," Violet replied, lowering her rifle, but keeping it ready. "Something you never understood." What followed was swift and professionally handled. Judge Hamilton and his federal marshals took custody of all prisoners, including One-Eyed Sam and other conspirators who'd been rounded up throughout territory. Evidence Violet and Kangi Sapa had gathered was formally presented and accepted, becoming part of federal case that would eventually result in dozens of convictions and restoration of millions of dollars in stolen property. But for Violet, real victory wasn't measured in legal outcomes or financial compensation. It was measured in knowledge that she'd stood up to powerful enemies, and one that she'd honored memory of those who died for justice, and that she'd found someone who saw her as equal partner rather than property to be protected. As they stood together in hotel room after prisoners had been led away, both understood their relationship had been forged in circumstances most couples would never experience. They'd seen each other at worst and best, had trusted each other with their lives, and had discovered their individual strengths were multiplied when combined with someone who shared their values and determination. So, what happens now? Violet asked, looking out at town where normal life was already beginning to resume, despite storms still raging outside. Now we build something good from what we've been given. Kangi Sapa replied, his arms settling around her shoulders, with natural ease born from weeks of shared danger and growing love. Water flows for everyone who needs it. Land goes to people who'll use it honestly, and we make sure this kind of corruption doesn't take root again. The wedding that followed was small and private, conducted according to customs, honoring both their cultural backgrounds. Marie served as witness, Dr. Hale provided medical certification required by territorial law, and Paul Larkin used his authority as sheriff to ensure all legal requirements were properly met. But real ceremony took place beside Creek, where Violet's mother had filed her water claim years earlier with Tallulah and surviving members of Kangi Sapa's band serving as witnesses to vows spoken in both English and Lakota. Words they chose weren't about romance or passion, but about partnership and mutual respect and commitment to building something good from resources they'd been given. Years later, when travelers asked about unusual partnership between white woman and Lakota warrior, managing some of most valuable water rights in territory, answer was always same. They'd found each other during time when justice seemed impossible, and powerful men thought they could take whatever they wanted from those too weak to resist. They'd proven those powerful men wrong, and in doing so they'd discovered that most important victories weren't won through violence or political maneuvering, but through quiet determination of ordinary people who refused to accept that wrong was stronger than right. The water still flowed, carrying with it memory of all who died to keep it free, and promise of all who would benefit from its fair distribution. In Wolf's Crossing, that was legacy enough for any lifetime.